Hi, this is Chris Myers Cybermotion, and I want to talk about some of the creative uses of 32-bit floating point color. Now, 32-bit float is one of the hot topics in compositing software. It's supported by several packages, such as Adobe After Effects 7, Apple Shake, Autodesk Combustion, and Ion Digital Fusion. It's usually highly coveted by visual effects people. However, there's some really creative motion graphics applications for it as well. You can create some really nice hot glowing looks this way. So let's talk a little bit about what floating point is. Rather than defining colors from 0 to 255, color values are defined as from 0 to 1. 0 is black, 1 is white. Now here's the catch with floating point. You can define a color that's less than 0, or blacker than black, and a color that's greater than 1, in other words, whiter than white. These software packages will keep track of these under-order values and can retrieve them later if needed. For example, if you add a bunch of things together and come up with a very bright image, later on, you can then fade it out and still retain all that brightness. It just won't become a gray blob. So let's see floating point in action on a typical image, and then let's show some creative uses for it. Now, traditionally, to take advantage of floating point in a program like After Effects, you need what's called an HDR, or High Dynamic Resolution image. A camera raw photo taken by a digital SLR is an example of a HDR image, and it has values that are below 0 and higher than 1. For example, if I do Command-E or Control-E to edit external, I'll open up the raw camera dialog inside Photoshop. And you'll see that I've temporarily turned the exposure way down on this shot. The normal exposure is up around here somewhere. And I can make it a brighter exposure if I want to, or a darker exposure if I want to. Let's go back into After Effects. And the question is, how do we bring those exposures back up to where we can see them again? Well, in After Effects 7, there's a brand new plugin called Exposure. It's under Color Correction, Exposure. And what this does is allows me to go ahead and raise my exposure back up again to retrieve those values that I had temporarily pushed below 0, below black, and bring them back into the visible range again. Now, one common issue when you have a nice bright image like this is if you go fade it out over time, you get these intermediate gray values. Areas that are bright just become this dulled out sort of color. Now we'll go ahead and calculate a RAM preview here so you can see this in action. So this is the type of fade out we've become used to in a lot of images. Everything goes to a shade of gray. I'll stop here somewhere in the middle so we can compare it. Okay, this is After Effects in normal mode. Now After Effects Professional now supports something called 32-bit floating point mode. To access it, you need to go to File, Project Settings, and go ahead and change the color depth to this new 32-bit per channel float mode. Click OK, and you see what happened to our image. Even though the sky is darker, the light sources are still bright. And as we fade out, it's as if I was lowering the exposure on the camera. The very last thing to go are these bright light sources. They hang on forever. And the reason is back early in this image, these lights had color values greater than 1. In fact, if I look back up in this info window here when I drag over it, you'll see that some of them have values of 4 and 3, much higher than the 1 that normally defines a white value. By keeping track of that information, brighter than white, darker than black, we have all sorts of flexibility to later retrieve these colors in After Effects. There's a lot you can do with that. Now you don't need HDR images or even the exposure plugin to take advantage of floating point in programs like After Effects. As long as you have some treatment or some combination of images that adds up to a white that's brighter than white, a blown out white, or subtracts down to a black darker than 0, something that goes below in the shadows, you can go ahead and retrieve it later using floating point. Here I'm back in After Effects. I'm going to switch back into 8-bit mode here for a second by holding Option or Alt and changing my project settings back to 8-bit. And here I have some normal footage of a drummer. Let's say that I want to add a lighting effect to this. I turn on this lighting layer I've picked up from Artbeats, some really cool lights, and I'll put it in Add mode on top of the drummer. I'm going to start having some whites that blow out here, and if you look at my info window, with 255 being the maximum value, you'll see I have some areas where these values are completely clipped out. They're brighter than white, but my monitor can't show that in 8-bit mode, so it's clipping them at white. Let's go even more extreme. I'll take that lighting layer and duplicate it. Now I have a really blown out image. Now if I took this composite into another composition later on and faded it out, you'll notice that my very bright areas just go to shades of gray. Not so interesting, to be completely honest. Their white values are still 255, 255, 255 as I drag over them, but you notice my alpha channel's fading out. Okay, here comes the magic. If I switch into floating point mode, hold Option or Alt and click on this twice, I've retrieved those brighter than white values. And again, if you watch the info window, I still have RGB values that are greater than 1 even during this fade out. So I'll start back at the head here, I have my completely bright image, and while I fade out, you'll see that I'm getting a much more accurate and a much more believable lighting effect before the whole thing fades out. I'm not keeping my blown out areas and letting them just go through gray. I'm keeping my blown out areas and then just slowly reducing the amount of light hitting them as I fade out. So again, here I am in 32-bit mode and back at 8-bit mode. Big difference. And this is another reason why you might want to use 32-bit float even for normal motion graphics or editing tasks.